Thank you for that, Phumzile. So we are now started recording. I hope everybody has accepted the fact that this is a recorded presentation. So today we're going to be looking at something that confuses us as we start our postgraduate research, but also later on as we do other research, when we've got to try and think about what kind of research is appropriate for what kind of study that we want to do. And as soon as we start looking at things beyond just our ordinary collection of data in the wards, we start seeing this word paradigm, and that throws us a little bit. And often people say, oh, paradigms are only for the qualitative studies. But that's not entirely true. So let's talk about where the term paradigm fits in. So the term paradigm is actually a broad, overarching framework that guides us in designing and conducting our research. So the various paradigms represent some sort of assumption about the nature of reality as we see it, and our role as researchers, and the purpose of our research, and the methods used to collect and analyze the data. So different research paradigms are based on different philosophical assumptions and are used to answer different research questions. So I'm going to be honest with you here. I asked ChatGPT to give me some examples of paradigms, and these are the paradigms here. But I think before we even get to paradigms, let's talk about, or the examples of paradigms, let's talk about the fact that we have quantitative and qualitative research. I think that is the very first place where study design types get classified into two different things. So the quantitative studies is what most of us are used to. That is where we tally up numbers, we count things, we start comparing things, we have a hypothesis. And then the qualitative is a little different, because there we can go a little bit more subjective, because we are looking at how people respond to things, what people feel about things, etc. It's not just a numbers game. And so we've got this division of research types into quantitative and qualitative. So where does paradigms fit in? So paradigms is a little bit different. Some of these paradigms will use quantitative research, and others will use qualitative research. So it's a little bit of a different classification. And for us, if you just get quantitative and qualitative separated in your minds, that is kind of enough until you start going into doing a little bit more qualitative work in your research. And then you're going to have to start thinking about, are you looking at a more specific type of paradigm? So let's have a look at these 5 examples. We first of all have positivism. And the reason I've put positivism there is that's kind of where we are situated when we look at quantitative research. So this paradigm is based on the assumption that there's an objective reality that can be measured and observed. So there's no opinions about it. This is, we look at what we assume to be facts. It emphasizes the use of scientific methods to test your hypotheses and generalize findings to larger populations. So positivism is a paradigm that emphasizes the use of empirical and scientific methods to study observable phenomena. So that's kind of where most of us sit in clinical research. So quantitative research is often associated with positivism, but it's not always necessarily always positivist. So positivism is a research paradigm that emphasizes the use of scientific methods to study observable phenomena and assumes that objective reality exists. That means that there is only one truth and can be measured and observed. The positivists use quantitative methods and then focus on testing hypotheses and generalizing findings to larger populations. So this is what we are all most comfortable with, and I'm thinking all of us are identifying with this. So quantitative research involves the collection and analysis of numerical data, and we use statistical methods. It aims to measure and quantify relationships between variables, test hypotheses, and we use stats. While quantitative research is often used within the positivist paradigm, it can also be used within other paradigms, such as pragmatism, which we're going to look at just now. Quantitative research can be positivist, but it is not inherently positivist. The paradigm that underpins quantitative research will depend on the philosophical assumption and research questions being addressed. So we often get people calling us positivists, and actually that is true. We are positivists because we use statistics. We assume that our data can be counted and generalized, and we can play around with statistics. But we are not only positivist. We can actually go into the realm of pragmatism. So pragmatism, and we know the word pragmatic. The word pragmatic means, it just makes sense to use it, that kind of feel about it. This paradigm is based on the assumption that knowledge is constructed through experience, and that ideas and theories should be evaluated based on their usefulness in solving practical problems. It emphasizes the use of mixed methods to apply research findings to real-world problems. So pragmatism is a paradigm that emphasizes the practical consequences of ideas and action. So pragmatists will use mixed methods, and I'm talking about not only qualitative and quantitative. It will be whether it's a cohort, an RCT, a case study, case series, whatever, various methods. So pragmatists will use mixed methods and often focus on applying research finding to real world problems. So you can see that in many respects, we are also in our kind of research in the clinical studies, we're also quite pragmatic. So not only are we positivists, but we are pragmatists. So let's move on to three others that are used quite a lot, not in our discipline, but it does give you an idea of where we could be going. So interpretivism, and I've got to tell you something very funny. Whenever I wrote the word interpretivism up, it's come up as a spelling error, but that is correctly spelled. So it's not a word that dictionaries are familiar with. So interpretivism is based on the assumption that reality is subjective and individuals construct their own understanding of reality. So there are some students who have done this kind of work where we look at how patients experience various things, looking at how patients, what the reasons are possibly behind poor compliance with drugs. Maybe they see things a little bit differently to the way you see things. So interpretivism emphasizes the use of qualitative methods. So it's going to be things like questionnaires, focus groups, getting people to talk so that you can understand the meaning that individuals ascribe to their experiences. It's a paradigm that emphasizes the subjective and interpretive nature of social reality. Interpretivists will use qualitative methods and often focus on understanding the meaning that individuals ascribe to their experiences. So one very good PhD student that came through several years ago looked at how patients experienced a diagnosis of osteosarcoma and how the caregivers dealt with these things. These are all things, so the caregiver and the patient with osteosarcoma will have their own realities around how they're experiencing that disease. So it's not what, so if it's a mother who's got a child with osteosarcoma, her experiences are going to be very different to the child who's actually the one suffering from the disease. So here we can see that people are experiencing the same situation, but very differently. So it's not easy to measure this in terms of numbers. So interpretivism is also something that we can delve into to give us a better understanding of how medicine actually enacts itself with people. Another paradigm that is often used is the critical theory paradigm, which is based on the assumption that social reality is shaped by power relations and social structures. And it emphasizes the use of qualitative methods to analyze the way in which social structures and power relations reproduce social inequality. So here we start looking at things like gender-based violence, research into gender-based violence, minority group issues, etc. So critical theory really does look at power play. Paternalistic attitudes in medicine could be based on critical theory. So if you're trying to do some qualitative research to see whether doctors are still coming across a lot more paternalistic after being trained in the more modern methods, then critical theory is the way to go to design your interventions. And then the last one I want to discuss is postmodernism. And this is very much the woke generation. This paradigm is based on the assumption that reality is constructed through language and discourse and that there's no objective truth. And we see this in the news quite a lot, their truth, our truth, and what is the real truth. And this is where we're looking at postmodernism. It emphasizes the use of qualitative methods to deconstruct the dominant discourses and analyze ways in which power is exercised through language and discourse. It's a paradigm that challenges the notion of objective truth and emphasizes the subjective nature of reality. It assumes that reality is constructed through language and discourse, and that different individuals and groups construct their own understanding of a reality. What's playing through the media over the last 2 years, and this is postmodernist completely, is the issue, it's not so big in this country, but the issue of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry and their truths as opposed to the truths of the British people, how people have experienced things differently. So that is a very postmodern issue. People keep saying they people sympathizing with them, people who are not sympathizing with them all say that their truth is different to the real truth. But what is the real truth? So that is postmodernist. And it's not an area that I see, that I personally see medical research being able to go into. But it is important when you start thinking about other areas, how people perceive things to be a little bit different to the way you perceive them. So these are just 5 examples of different paradigms. And different paradigms will use either qualitative or quantitative methods, but there are many more paradigms in this. And when Prof. Naina gives a talk, she can show you up to about 20, but I don't think we need to know all of those. We just need to know that they are there. And what you do need to know from this slide going forward in your research careers is there's a smorgasbord of different ways of placing yourself to think about how to do research. It's not only quantitative and qualitative. For the kinds of questions that we have to answer for our patients, sitting in the paradigm of positivism and pragmatism, you'll get the most of your work done. But if you're wanting to find more subtle things out, want to move your research into a slightly different area, then start looking at the others. There are plenty beyond positivism, pragmatism, that will be able to answer different research questions. Okay, so now let's look at evidence-based medicine. So how does paradigms fit into evidence-based medicine? So first of all, the term evidence-based medicine is only about 32 years old. So it's come into being relatively recently, but the actual practice of evidence-based medicine has been happening for several hundred years. It's just increased and become, and I'll go through the history of this, how it's become an imperative right now. So evidence-based medicine means we've got to create evidence. How do we create evidence? We create evidence by asking research questions. And to ask various research questions, we will look at what type of study we are going to use. So that is evidence-based medicine. And let us be comfortable in our positivist paradigm at the moment. So I'm now going to stop talking about paradigms. I'm going to assume that we're going to be looking only at positivist pragmatic paradigms, moving towards pragmatic actually, and just show you how evidence-based medicine came into being as a term and how maybe it is being misinterpreted, and that we should reflect on what we are trying to achieve through evidence-based medicine. So as I've mentioned just now, evidence-based medicine has been around for a while as in an undefined and unrecognized form for centuries, with medicine being practiced based on experience and shared observation. The concept has, however, had to be tightened up over the last century, and I'm going to go into that a little bit later. But if we look right back in the 1700s, 1747, the impact of vitamin C on scurvy was discovered by James Lind in an experiment where sailors were provided different diets in order to see if scurvy could be controlled. And even today, we celebrate May the 20th as World Clinical Trials Day to commemorate the start of that particular trial. So that was 270 years ago that we had a trial that actually still impacts us today. But the first double-blinded control trial was only carried out in the 1940s, as was the first randomized control trial. But interestingly, penicillin actually was never tested with a double-blinded randomized control trial. So originally, Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, and he used it in 1 adult and 3 babies in 1930 to treat conjunctivitis. In 1932, he treated a medical student who was supposed to participate in an inter-hospital rifle shooting competition who had conjunctivitis. And it was very important because he was a champion. So he had to get him better, and he treated him successfully. But the first purified penicillin was available in the 1940s only. And in August 1942, a 52-year-old man with meningitis who was going to die, he was moribund, was given penicillin. And of course, this patient survived. And Alexander Fleming wrote that case up in the Lancet, and it was published in 1943 as a case study. At the time, in the 1940s, it was wartime in Britain, and the War Cabinet called for a meeting in September 1942. So that was a month after this particular case had occurred with this meningitis patient. Then the penicillin committee was created, and they coordinated penicillin to be created to be developed in large quantities, or to be manufactured in large quantities, with a collaboration between American and English companies. By 1944, in D-Day, which saw huge carnage of Allied troops, there was enough penicillin to treat all of the wounded Allied troops. So here we have a single published case study, which was enough in the emergency of war to roll out and use quickly and efficiently. And I think every one of us listening to this talk now has had penicillin in their lives. Today, it is still routinely used in people as well as in animals. But not all novel drug interventions in the 20th century were as extraordinary in improving human quality of life. Thalidomide was introduced in 1956 and was indicated for anxiety, sleeping issues, tension, and morning sickness, although it had never been tested in pregnant women. Miscarriages and teratogenic effects became apparent by the late 1950s and in the 1960s. More than 10,000 babies were born across the world with a range of severe deformities, resulting in what became known at the time as the biggest man-made medical disaster ever. And there's a picture over here to show that there were a whole lot of limb issues with babies born. Intellectually, they were fine. Many of these people grew up to be professionals, but they had serious limb deformities. But beyond this type of unintended medical blunder by the pharmaceutical industry, other horrific medical research missteps were intentionally performed. The atrocities of the Second World War crimes against humanity in concentration camps led to the Nuremberg Code after the Nuremberg trials, which showed what had been done to adults and children in the interests of furthering scientific understanding in the concentration camps in Germany. In America, the Tuskegee experiment was carried out between 1932 and 1972, that's 40 years, in Alabama, on a group of African-American men who all had syphilis. The purpose of the study was to observe the effects of the disease when untreated. So in 1932, there was no treatment for syphilis. So when this study was started, it was to see how the disease progressed. However, we've already spoken about penicillin. By 1947, penicillin was widely available for everybody, not just the war effort, and had become the standard treatment for syphilis. So by 1947, this trial should have come to an end, but it was withheld for another 25 years so that this study people could still see what was going to happen. And as a result, more than 100 of those study participants died. These and more blights on the 20th century clinical research and care record saw that we had to recognize that medical research and medical ethics needed some sort of rectification. So there was a big push for medical ethics, but also rigor in terms of how to get research done properly and get it to the bedside. So in the 1960s, a randomized controls trial was still a rarity. However, our advances in statistical analysis and research design saw that the practice did pick up over the next decades. Nevertheless, in practice, clinicians were still trained to solve clinical problems by combining reflection on their practice, understanding of underlying biology, and referring to textbooks or experts. Some people refer to this as the art of medicine, but there is more to medicine than that, as we all know today. There's nothing wrong with the art of medicine. In fact, people rue the loss of the art of medicine, but textbooks, understanding underlying biology and reflection on practice and listening to experts is still a very important part of clinical practice today. But in the 1960s, the gap between the bench and the bedside was recognized, particularly by the couple Suzanne and Robert Fletcher over here. In 1982, they published a textbook that described the scientific basis for clinical care in this book called Clinical Epidemiology. In 2020, It was in its 6th edition over here, and the author is their son now in this particular edition. At the same time, Alvin Feinstein over here, he was a mathematician who became a doctor. He recognized the uncertainty inherent in medical practice at the bedside. He was critical of public health studies and introduced rigor. He also played a role in bringing epidemiology and medical research together. So the need to apply research in clinical decision-making was highlighted in the 70s and 80s. And to this end, critical appraisal for research for clinical practice began to gain traction. And now often referred to as one of the fathers of evidence-based medicine, David Sackett, over here. David Sackett began using critical appraisal techniques in his bedside teaching in the 80s in Canada. So we had this move from being able to push things through like penicillin to becoming a lot more aware of how things can be abused, how people can be made to believe medicine when maybe in medical approaches that maybe weren't great. I mean, the Tuskegee trial was a terrible thing for anybody to have gone through. Okay, so in 1990, one of David Sackett's students over here, Gordon Guyot, began building on David Sackett's works, and he introduced the term scientific medicine to describe this concept. But this choice of words seemed derogatory to many people who still believed that traditional methods of clinical practice were important. So Guyot coined the inoffensive term evidence-based medicine so that people could still be comfortable in their traditional methods of medicine. The term evidence-based medicine is seen for the first time in 1991 in the ACP Journal Club editorial. So in 1992, Guyot was part of the first evidence-based medicine working group, which consisted of several scholars, including David Sackett, who published the first comprehensive description of evidence-based medicine and how it was incorporated into the curriculum at McMaster's University. The concept of evidence-based medicine, or EBM as I'll refer to it from now, was now born and has influenced medical education and other professional practice globally since that time. The main thrust of EBM in publications by Guyot and colleagues, if you go back into the history, shows how to replace an old way of doing things with a new way. In examples, a clinical scenario is presented in his text, and the old way and the new way are illustrated in clinician responses to show an advancement in thinking. So for example, here we have a scenario. A previously well 43-year-old male patient has a grand mal seizure. ECGs, etc., are normal, but the patient is concerned about possible future seizures. In the old way, over here, the resident would be told by the senior resident, who is supported by the attending physician, that the chances of repeated seizures are high. The resident relays this information to the patient, advising him not to drive, continue with medication, and have follow-ups with his family physician. So you end up with a patient that it's not happy, he can't drive. What the new way would be is that the resident goes off to the library, does an electronic search, finds an appropriate article based on titles, takes the information and relays it to the patient. So the article states that the risk for another seizure in the first year is 43 to 51%. The 3-year risk is 51 to 60%. And after 18 months of being seizure-free, the chances have reduced to 20%. The patient is advised to continue with medication and have follow-ups with his family physician. Nothing is said about driving. In this scenario, now remember we're talking about the early 1990s, that's 30 years ago. We've got to look at the context. The resident has used 30 minutes to go to the library to find this and has probably had to pay a couple of dollars if they had to look for an article that was not in the library. So the context of time needs to be borne in mind when we look at Guyot's examples. In the early 90s, most people had desktop computers at home and the internet wasn't there yet. University subscriptions to multitudes of journals were not available, and we didn't have cell phones. We have access to journal on your cell phone. In essence, though, what Guyot was getting at is that once a clinical problem was identified, instead of relying on intuition and unsystematic clinical experience and old-fashioned advice from seniors to come to a clinical solution, research should form the basis of clinical problem solving. To be an EBM-orientated clinician, the young doctor would build their clinical experience through systematic record keeping regarding the understanding of mechanisms of disease as insufficient and build expertise by following certain rules of evidence. That is, looking at the literature with a critical eye and accepting levels of evidence as an hierarchy of certainty, which brings us to this pyramid that we all know about. So it was about 2006, Glover et al. Came up with the pyramid. And from this pyramid, you can see that there are various types of studies, and different types of studies here actually answer different types of research questions. So we go from some pyramids don't even have animal studies and laboratory studies. In fact, the original pyramid did not have. And then we move on to case studies and reports, which a lot of people call anecdotal studies. And I will talk later that it cannot be anecdotal anymore when you've got lots of the same case reports and case studies series coming from across the globe. Then we've got case control studies, cohort studies, randomized control studies, and then we've got systematic and reviews, meta-analysis, and sometimes people on top put guidelines over here because they've already used meta-analyses. So clinical evidence was graded for certainty. So there's a lot less certainty between case controls and randomized control trials, with expert opinion being the least certain. So expert opinion would fall under at case series case reports. And as we go up, there is increased certainty until you've got most certainty at the top of the pyramid. But very soon, the randomized control trial in its various forms, like the blinded randomized control trial or the double-blinded or the double-blind non-randomized, would become considered as the gold standard for clinical evidence. And this is where things have gone a little bit awry. But in 1993, the Cochrane collaboration was formed, and I'm going to talk about that to get back to the pyramid here, which took the level of certainty further from randomized control trials, which was the gold standard. And it developed the meta-analysis of data into a sophisticated methodology that strives to find results as close to absolute certainty as possible. And some may now consider a meta-analysis to have the highest level of certainty. However, I have seen in the last few years that meta-analysis can be subject to a lot of subjectivity as well. I've seen people use exactly the same methods, exactly the same papers, and come out with divergent results. Some pyramids have referred to this increase in certainty as we go up the side as an increase in quality. And that is where we've made a big mistake. This is a misunderstanding. The pyramid can be read either as reflecting the totality of evidence, it's holistically, or improperly as an hierarchy that does not take into account the certainty of evidence as we go up and involve a narrower focus and reduced complexity. I have seen some randomized control trials that are of dastardly quality, terrible quality, meta-analyses of terrible quality, and I've seen some case studies, case control studies that are high quality. So there's a lot of people have got an arrow, and I'll show you, I'll get to a diagram just now that shows an increase in quality here. That is wrong. Today, many clinical researchers consider only the RCT, possibly as a result of this manipulation of the meaning of evidence-based medicine. They accept only large double-blinded randomized controlled trials as evidence, and all the other evidence here is neglected or dismissed as poor quality. Whilst it is appropriate in novel drug development to hold to this standard, it's not always suitable for answering every clinical research question posed by a clinical problem. So what we had here was good intention to show totality of evidence with an increase in certainty has been misinterpreted to mean that only randomized controlled trials are accepted and that there is an hierarchy of quality, and it's got nothing to do with quality. So the initial description of evidence-based medicine was met with circumspection. Some people saw the definition as too narrow, and others deliberately narrowed it further in order to reduce the level of complexity of evaluation. EBM was a very hot topic in the 90s as a concept, and also as it was being molded to address misunderstandings around its goals and its practical implementation. But how was it possible for a busy clinician to keep up with the then burgeoning information overload? So journals such as the ACP Journal Club and Evidence-Based Medicine were started. To quote Davidoff et al., including Sackett, to publish the gold that intellectually intense processes will mine from the ore of about 100 of the world's top journals. So what we started seeing now was the formation of journals that looked at systematic reviews only. So was this appropriate to dispense with the art of medicine? And what about the patient? So if we go back to what Sackett originally wanted out of evidence-based medicine, Sackett defined evidence-based medicine as the confluence of clinical judgment. That means your experience. That means going to your seniors, talking to your colleagues, with patient values and preferences and relevant scientific evidence. I think what had been missing before was a focus on this area. But what had been, as a result of this discussion around evidence-based medicine, a lot of people started seeing only part of this as valid and this as no longer having a say in evidence-based medicine, whereas the original meaning was the confluence. Evidence-based medicine takes all of these into consideration. So in 1995, Sackett acknowledged that evidence-based medicine was evolving and adapting, and he defined evidence-based medicine then as the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of individual patients. The practice of evidence-based medicine means integrating individual clinical expertise with the best available external clinical evidence from systematic research. So this was a move forward from the 1992 definition, as now personal expertise, clinical judgment is recognized, and best available external clinical evidence is defined as clinically relevant research, often from the basic sciences of medicine, but especially from patient-centered clinical research. Sackett, who was the father of evidence-based medicine, stressed the point that evidence-based medicine is not cookbook medicine because it requires a bottom-up approach that integrates the best external evidence with individual clinical expertise and patient's choice. External clinical evidence can inform but can never replace individual clinical expertise, and it is this expertise that decides whether the external evidence applies to the individual patient at all? And if so, how it should be integrated into a clinical decision. So let's get back to randomized control trials. However, many have interpreted evidence-based medicine as a cookbook approach, negating all research that was not a randomized control trial and discounting clinical expertise and patient's choice as irrelevant. They have reduced the complexity of clinical decision-making to a yes or no response to a single study method, the randomized control trial. So in 2003, Smith and Pell made the point regarding the universal acceptance of only the RCT as relevant clinical evidence in their editorial called Parachute Use to Prevent Death and Major Trauma Related to Gravitational Challenge, a systematic review of randomized controlled trials. And I've got that over here. You can actually go and you can find this article by taking that title into Google and you'll find it. So this is what the experiment was about. Here, a group of participants would be randomly selected to one of two groups. The intervention arm would receive a parachute and the control arm would not. So they'd obviously be given a pack that weighs the same as the others, but there's no parachute. I guess for true blinding, they would be given packs weighed to the same as the parachute packs, but without the parachutes. All participants would jump from the plane to test their level of trauma on reaching the earth. So we'd throw them all out. Those with parachutes, their parachutes would open, the others, their parachutes wouldn't open, and then we would go and assess the carnage on the ground afterwards to see if the parachutes worked. So Smith and Pell finished their article by saying, "We feel assured that those who advocate evidence-based medicine and criticize the use of interventions that lack an evidence base will not hesitate to demonstrate their commitment by volunteering for a double-blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled crossover trial." So the crossover trial would mean that in the first round, the patients that survived or the patients that got the parachutes the first time around would be taken back up into the air, and in the next round, they would not be given parachutes. They would be the placebo arm. So this really does bring home the fact that randomized control trials are not always appropriate under every set of circumstances. So from the early 90s, publications around evidence-based medicine evolved from describing the concrete concepts such as certainty of evidence, etc., to being more inclusive of clinician expertise and patient consideration. However, we have regulatory bodies and other institutions that have dehumanized evidence-based medicine and often consider only an RCT, especially as we have seen recently in pandemic situations. So what do we do about this? And I'm going to pose my own thoughts that are about to be published. So as soon as it's published, I will allow anybody who's interested, I will send a link to the paper. But this is the original pyramid that came out by Glover, which shows that with the lowest form of certainty is the background information or expert opinion, and we move up in certainty up to some systematic reviews. So this was around about 2006, and this is the mistake that was made. Quality of evidence. We can see terrible quality in systematic reviews, and we can see excellent quality in case study controls. So this here should have meant certainty of evidence, should have been certainty of evidence and not quality of evidence. So what I propose that we should be looking at in terms of evidence-based medicine, and this is what is going to be published, is that we do not look at an hierarchy to start with. We do not worry about quality other than if it's published or not, and we don't give an hierarchy or a weight to anything. We look at the totality of evidence. We look at everything that is available. So we will look at all clinical studies. So in clinical studies, you'll see some are population-wide studies, randomized controlled trials, cohort studies, case control studies, case reports, and case series. From these here, when you look at these, you then subdivide them into, do they say an intervention works? In fact, is it green? Does it definitely say it does not work? In which case we give it a red. Is it inconclusive at that point? And you give it an orange. And that's a way you can score various things. When it comes to your lower order lower order reviews, we look at expert opinions, editorials, narratives, and you start weighing them up and you see how many people in the expert opinions have actually said, yes, this does work, or no, it doesn't work, or we need more research. And we start getting a picture of what people are saying across the globe, people who do not know each other. As people are publishing and you're seeing this come up in your PubMed searches, you start looking at them through this lens to see how much research is coming through. Looking at mechanism of action for various interventions, sometimes this section will not be included, but if you're looking at the impact of a drug, you'd definitely be looking at in vivo studies that have come through, in vitro studies, and in silico. And again, you're going to divide them into what is positive, what is negative, what says there should be more information. And then, of course, we look at meta-analysis and systematic reviews and guidelines, and to see again, what are we scoring around here? And clearly, if you're seeing more red around this, let me go back. If you're seeing more red in this, once you've scored your papers, then clearly your intervention is not working. And maybe you have to go and look at the trials to see why it's not working. Maybe the mechanism of action shows you right up front why it won't work. If you are seeing more green, you're going to think, okay, why is this showing me that it's working? We're seeing mechanism of action and clinical studies are showing that it's working. If it's more orange, as it should be in the beginning of a pandemic, if you're looking at repurposing a drug where people are saying, we're seeing an indication, but we don't know yet, then you've got to go in and have a look and start weighing the studies up and start looking at the quality of the studies at that point. But if you are looking at totality of evidence in a holistic way, there's no way anybody can say there's insufficient evidence. You might just be able to say evidence is not yet certain. So let's have a look at how this weighs up against the original pyramid. In the original pyramid, only part of this was taken into consideration. There was no mechanism of action or laboratory studies considered at all. So I think it's important that we look completely at totality of evidence and not just be selective in what we're going to be looking at. Good, so that is evidence-based medicine, the history, and then my take on it. And I'm happy now to field some questions on that. We've still got 10 minutes for questions. Does anybody want to comment on evidence-based medicine at all? How you've been taught it, how you feel it should be? Do you think I am wrong? Do you think I'm right? David Sackett eventually gave up after a while, so he's not even talking about it anymore because it was taken so far away from his initial philosophy of what it should be. Well, if there are no comments, then we can close today's session early. Thank you, Tamlin. Was that just saying a thank you? Or did you make a comment?
Yes, it's a thank you and a comment. I think just going back to the circle that you diagram versus the triangle. And I think just going back to how we've been taught since high school and progressively that RCTs are the gold standard and everything else follows suit. This is an incredible way of looking at things differently, considering all types of information. And I see the value of using something like this in research, trying to identify studies that you find valuable and that you feel that are valuable, what other people are saying versus what's out there in terms of published research. And I think that it's a very easy way to spot what is inconclusive, what is agreeing and what is disagreeing if you're planning any type of study, especially an implementation-based study.
Yeah,
So thank you so
for
much.
that. Yeah. I think what got me really excited about evidence-based medicine was people were saying through the pandemic that only randomized control trials count. And I thought to myself, I have supervised so many really good PhD by publication students. I'm proud of my students' work. I know my students are producing good quality work. Who are they to tell me that because it's not an RCT, it's poor quality? And that's what got me thinking about how other people's minds have become corrupted, I would say, to ignore everything else. Kind of what they're saying is the majority of our research is useless. It's futile. Why do it? We're only going to do randomized control trials. So let's just do a randomized control trials on an appendectomy. See how that will work. Now, sometimes it's just not practical. So that's got me really excited in not a happy way that we've got to correct, for the sake of David Sackett, this misinterpretation about an hierarchy, about gold standards, about quality. That is absolute rubbish. We've got to come back to thinking about what's good for the patient. What is humane? What is humanitarian? What is contributing to science? And a lot of the stuff that they absolutely ignore, that laboratory work, they used to just ignore it. It doesn't poo-poo it. It's absolutely, it goes against the Hippocratic Oath. So thanks, Tamlin, for that comment. Is anybody else got a comment? Okay, then next week, we were scheduled to have the library speak, and I've been trying to contact a librarian and I have not had a response. So thanks, Elliot. So I've approached somebody to give a different talk on how to actually read a paper critically, but he hasn't responded either. But it's also the school holidays and we're about to go into a break until the end of April. So please just watch the announcements. There might not be a talk next week. It might be the last one now if I cannot find another speaker. Otherwise, the advert will be out on Monday or Tuesday. So thank you everybody again for being here and for listening. And we'll see each other again very soon. Bye-bye then.
Okay, bye-bye.